It is now December 2016, and it is time for us to evaluate how well we did with Farsight's Time Cross project in predicting the major news events for November 2016 using remote viewing. Remember, all remote viewing for this project is done during the month in advance of the event month. So, the remote viewing for the month of November was done and uploaded to YouTube for all to see in October 2016. For the event month of November, we had 2 remote viewers working, Aziz Brown and Princess Janae. Dick Algeier was off that month due mostly to health reasons. So, let's get to it. As most of you who are following our project know, the targets, which are the focus of perception for our remote viewers, are determined by our automated news analysis process that we maintain in the Time Cross area of our website, updated daily, and which we encourage everyone to follow. To do this, we count major event story links on the main web pages of CNN, the international and US versions, the New York Times, and the BBC. For the month of November, there were 2 major events. The first was the hugely unexpected loss of Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump, and the second was the war in Syria and Iraq. Now, this month posed special problems for our project. Scheduled events, such as the American election, are prohibited in our project since we know that they are coming and the news media are talking about them non-stop. So we are only able to count unscheduled events. So we cannot have as a target, say, people lining up to vote during an American election, nor in past months could we have, say, people lining up to vote during the Brexit campaign in Britain. Similarly, campaign rallies for an upcoming election are prohibited unless something unscheduled happens at a rally, such as a bomb blast or a violent riot, for example. Now, the aftermath of such elections is fair game, however, since what happens after an election can be unscheduled, totally surprising, and huge news. For example, in July 2016, we had the resignation of David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Britain, as a consequence of the Brexit vote, and that resignation speech was clearly described by one of our remote viewers. So, for the month of November, by far the hugest story in the news was the aftermath of Hillary Clinton's loss to Donald Trump. The event was a total surprise. It was not predicted by any of the major news outlets. Moreover, it was literally impossible for us to count the related news stories on our major news outlets since there were so many that went in so many different directions. From a political perspective, it was like the sky was falling, and the major news outlets, well, they sort of went berserk. It was impossible to tell if a particular story was directly about the event or indirectly about the event. Most times it is easy to figure this out, but the month of November was really different. Nonetheless, what we can do is identify when it all began. Without question, the collapse of Hillary Clinton's campaign against Donald Trump began with a speech made by John Podesta on the night of the election. In this televised speech, he told a very expectant and worried audience in the Jacob Javits Convention Center that Hillary Clinton would not show up that night and that they should all go home as votes continued to be counted late into the evening and morning. He tried to keep a positive face, but it was clear that the campaign was looking face to face with a totally unexpected loss. Podesta made this speech on November 8th at Clinton's election night campaign headquarters at the Jacob Javits Convention Center in New York City. Now, the convention center is in Manhattan, near the Hudson River, Midtown, near 34th Street. The walls and roof of the front section of the convention center are essentially glass, and one can see the sky from the inside. It is surrounded by low-rise buildings, but the taller skyscrapers characteristic of Manhattan are visible further in the distance from the convention center. Well, as it turns out, that speech by John Podesta was perfectly described by Aziz Brown. He accurately covered the nature of the speech, the tone of the speech, the purpose of the speech, and he drew the face of John Podesta with remarkable accuracy. He also described the audience in the convention center, listening to the speech in spine-tingling detail. Moreover, he described the Javits Convention Center and its surrounding environment perfectly. In the description section immediately below this video, there is a link to a video of John Podesta giving this exact speech, and I encourage everyone to watch Aziz's session closely and compare it with what you see in the video. It is lots of fun to do this, and it's very educational as well. As we have shown you often during this Time Cross project, this is another example of remote viewing at its best. By watching our results, you really are getting a perfect lesson in how remote viewing works under great conditions. Now, Aziz did 2 sessions for 2 different targets for the month of November, and in his second session, he described what appears to be a volcanic eruption, one that was dominated by lots of particulate matter that extended high into the sky. Well, as it turned out, there was a volcanic eruption that hit the major news venues. The first time this has happened since we began this project back in May 2016. On November 25th, Mexico's Popocatépetl volcano erupted not far from Mexico City, sending ash miles into the air. In terms of the amount of news coverage for this event, as shown in our news analysis table, this was a relatively minor event. And this seems to reinforce what we have been finding to happen in our project from time to time. We seem to always get the major stories, but we also get some of the minor stories thrown into the mix. What is interesting from our perspective is that reporting volcanic activity on the front page of our major news outlets is relatively rare, but when it did happen, we got it. Now please remember that the criteria for a hit in the Time Cross project are different from those of a typical scientific experiment. With Time Cross, we are trying to persuade a skeptical public that remote viewing is real. This is a significant challenge for this experiment. We have to do more than simply describe a target event correctly. For a Time Cross remote viewing session to be a hit, you shouldn't have to scour the internet for corroborating data. It should be obvious. If it is a hit, the audience will recognize this without our help, and they will point it out to us, usually in the YouTube comments for the raw session. So in a sense, by engaging in social media, the YouTube audience is voting on whether or not a session is a hit for a given event that happens during a month. With respect to Aziz's first session, the YouTube comments overwhelmingly stated that his session described the speech by John Podesta. A majority of the YouTube audience also noted that Aziz's second session seemed to match the eruption of Mexico's Popocatépetl volcano. And in terms of the impact of the events, the speech by John Podesta was the biggest event of the month, and the remote viewing session for that was a clear home run. The volcano was a lesser event, but still it was identifiable as a major news story covered in some of our news outlets, and the remote viewing session saw it coming, so to speak. Now, in terms of the second most covered news event, that was the Middle East wars of Iraq and Syria. And as in the past, we have always been a bit concerned about including the Middle East wars in our project, since they seem to be ongoing, and in that respect they are sort of predictable. But we have continued to include the Iraq and Syria wars in our project because they have been regularly punctuated by very different and unusual events. However, unlike past months, nothing truly unusual was reported in the news during November that was unique in any meaningful sense. Now, Princess Janae's remote viewing session described what appears to be a missile launch from an area that seemed dry and somewhat mountainous, which seems to correspond with the Middle East. She also described an underground bunker, and the leader of the people who launched the missile wore garments that seemed Middle Eastern, such as a wrap around the head and the body. On the other hand, in some respects, her description of the leader seemed to remind me of Kim Jong-un, the president of North Korea. Also, and here is the real problem, we are facing a situation in which there may have been a failed launch sometime in early November in North Korea, and there were countless missile launches in Iraq and Syria. Moreover, many of the warring parties in Iraq and Syria have underground bunkers. There are also underground bunkers in North Korea. So unfortunately, none of these things were reported in sufficient detail in the major news outlets. The reports were headlines, but they were quite general, lacking the specifics that were characteristic of the news coverage that occurred in previous months. Bluntly, we at Farsight do not have enough information to be able to compare our remote viewing data regarding a missile launch to actual events so as to properly evaluate these data. Military intelligence would have such information, but that is not us. The wars in Iraq and Syria were the big news items, so that is where the target should be found. But since we are dependent on how much our news sources report, and we do not have enough information from available news stories to make a proper comparison, we have to say that the remote viewing session by Princess Jeanne remains inconclusive. If the remote viewing session described, say, the collapse of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France, and the Eiffel Tower at the end of the month was still standing, then we could say that the remote viewing data were amiss. But in the current situations regarding the wars in Iraq and Syria, as well as with respect to North Korea, there were missile launches. So we cannot say that the data are amiss. All we can say is that they are inconclusive. And this sometimes happens, especially in situations when the major news outlets are assigning most of their reporting assets to another story, such as the American presidential election. Overall, our Time Cross project is successfully reporting the major news stories to you a month in advance each month. Now, since we started this project in May 2016, we have not missed. So, together with some unexpected surprises, we continue to bring you tomorrow's news today, and quite accurately. Remember that this is an experiment, and we want to continue to see how this experiment, as it is currently structured, works out after a long period of trials. Nearly all of the events that we have reported have been top-ranked news stories of each month. And remember that this is a public experiment, and we are learning along with everyone else. So please continue to watch the monthly results for Farsight's Time Cross project. This is 2 videos each month. The first is the raw remote viewing results with predictions for the coming month, and the second is the results summary video, such as this video that you're watching right now, that comes out around the 10th or 11th of each month. And I must continue to mention that we are offering our Time Cross project free to the public as a way of demonstrating the reality and potential of remote viewing. But it does cost us a few $1,000s each month to do this. So for us to continue, we need your help by watching our mysteries projects. It is the only thing that pays the bills. Go to our website to see information about those projects that include remote viewing investigations into the 9/11 events, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the psychology of Adolf Hitler, and some amazing explorations into UFOs and extraterrestrial life. Also, we have just begun a new science vlog that we publish twice a week in our science YouTube channel, FarsightPress, so please subscribe to that channel. This is the same YouTube channel where we are publishing our Time Cross project that you are watching right now. And hey, stay ahead of the curve. Let the mainstream fade in the dust. Be there now.